Dear listener, I bring you 4 stories that will send shivers down your spine. Are they all real? I'll leave that for you to decide. At the end, leave your opinion in the comments. I've been a nurse at Stady Elizabeth Hospital in Baltimore for over a decade now. It's an old place, you know? All Gothic spires and shadowy corridors. I used to love the history of it, but now, well, let me start from the beginning. It was about 6 months ago when I first noticed something off. I was working the night shift, doing my usual rounds. The hospital is always eerie at night, but this was different. I turned a corner and saw a patient standing at the end of the hallway. Her gown was old-fashioned, and her eyes, they were just empty. I blinked, and she was gone. I told myself I was just tired, but it kept happening. Patients I'd never seen before, appearing and disappearing, always with those same empty eyes and looks of anguish on their faces. I started dreading my shifts, my heart racing every time I had to walk down a dark corridor alone. One night, I was updating some files when I noticed discrepancies. Patients listed that I couldn't remember treating. I dug deeper, and that's when I found an old journal hidden in the back of a filing cabinet. It belonged to a Dr. Emerson, dated back to the 1950s. What I read, God, I wish I could forget it. The journal detailed horrific experiments conducted right here in Stady Elizabeth. Surgeries without anesthesia, patients kept in isolation for months, treatments that violated every ethical standard we have. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely turn the pages. These weren't just random ramblings, they were dates, patient numbers, detailed notes. This was real. After that, things escalated. I'd be alone in a room, and suddenly, the temperature would drop. I'd hear whispers, like someone was right behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. Once, I saw my reflection in a mirror blink at me. I nearly quit that day, but I couldn't just leave. Those spirits, those poor patients, they needed someone to tell their story. I started researching, trying to find any records of these experiments. It wasn't easy. Most of the hospital's records from that time were lost in a convenient fire years ago. The more I dug, the worse things got. Objects would move on their own. Doors would slam shut, nearly catching my fingers. One night, I heard a child crying from inside a supply closet. When I opened the door, the sound stopped, but the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and fear. It all came to a head last week. I was working late, going through some old files in the basement archives. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and when I turned, I saw them dozens of ghostly figures, all those patients I'd been seeing. They were pointing urgently at a section of the wall. My hands trembling, I approached the wall. There was a loose panel, and behind it, God, I'll never forget what I found. Stacks of files detailing every experiment, every patient, every horror that had been covered up. As I pulled them out, I felt a presence behind me. In the reflection of an old computer screen, I saw him, Dr. Emerson, or what was left of him. His face was twisted with rage. I ran. I've never run so fast in my life. But I didn't leave empty-handed. I took those files straight to the police, to the press, to anyone who would listen. It's been a whirlwind since then. Investigations, media coverage, the hospital bored in chaos. But you know what? The spirits, I haven't seen them since that night. It's like they're finally at peace. The hospital feels different now, lighter somehow. We still have a long way to go to make things right, but at least now, the truth is out there. Those patients, they can finally rest. And maybe, just maybe, I can start to feel safe in these halls again. If you are enjoying it, please consider subscribing and clicking the like button to support my channel. It was early October, and the air had that crisp fall feel to it. I remember pulling my jacket tighter around me as I started my usual walk to school. Our town's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, so I never felt scared walking alone, even though it was barely light out. I'd gone about 2 blocks when I got this weird feeling. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck? Yeah, that. I glanced over my shoulder, but I didn't see anyone. Still, something felt off. As I turned onto Maple Street, I heard footsteps behind me. Not unusual, really. Other kids walked to school too. But when I looked back, there was this guy I didn't recognize. He was maybe in his 30s, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. I picked up my pace a little, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then he sped up too. My heart started racing, and I could feel my palms getting sweaty inside my jacket pockets. I decided to test if he was really following me. Instead of taking my usual left on Elm, I went right. He followed. I crossed the street. He crossed too. By now, my mouth was dry, and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. Hey! I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. Can I help you with something? He didn't answer. Just kept walking, closing the distance between us. I broke into a run. I could hear his footsteps getting faster behind me. Panic took over, and I sprinted down the sidewalk, my backpack thumping against me with each step. I darted between houses, hoping to lose him in the backyards I knew so well from countless games of hide and seek as a kid. But this wasn't a game. This was real, and I was terrified. I burst out onto Cedar Avenue, gasping for breath. Mrs. Johnson was out walking her dog. Mrs. Johnson. I yelled, my voice breaking. Please, I need help. She must have seen the fear on my face, because she immediately ushered me into her house and locked the door. As she called the police, I peered out the window, shaking. The man in the cap was nowhere to be seen. The cops came, took my statement, and drove me to school. They increased patrols in the neighborhood, but they never caught the guy. For weeks, I jumped at every shadow, constantly looking over my shoulder. My parents drove me to school for a while, but eventually I had to face my fear and walk again. It's been 2 years, and I still get anxious sometimes when I'm alone outside. I carry pepper spray now, and I'm always aware of my surroundings. That day changed me. It stole a piece of the safety and innocence I'd always taken for granted in our small town. The police say it might have been someone passing through, maybe casing houses for a burglary. But in my nightmares, I see those footsteps getting closer, and I wonder, what if he comes back? What if next time there's no Mrs. Johnson to save me? I know I'm not the only one who's gone through something like this, but knowing that doesn't make it easier. It just makes me angry that anyone has to feel the scared in their own neighborhood. So, yeah, that's my story. Not exactly the kind of excitement you want in a small town, you know. But I'm sharing it because I want people to be aware, to trust their instincts, and maybe, just maybe, to appreciate those boring, uneventful walks a little bit more. Because you never know when everything might change. It all started about 6 months ago when I moved into this charming little cottage in the English countryside. It was supposed to be my dream home, a quaint stone house with a thatched roof, surrounded by rolling hills and blooming gardens. I'd always dreamed of living in a place like this, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The first few weeks were absolutely idyllic. I spent my days tending to the garden, exploring the nearby village, and settling into my new life. But then, things started to change. It began with small noises, creaks, and thuds that I initially dismissed as the sounds of an old house settling. But as time went on, the noises became more distinct, more purposeful. They always seemed to come from the basement, a part of the house I rarely visited. I told myself it was probably just mice or maybe a cat that had found its way in. One evening, as I was curled up on the sofa with a book, I heard a loud crash from below. My heart started racing, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I had to investigate, but every instinct screamed at me to run. With trembling hands, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the basement door. As I descended the creaky wooden stairs, the musty smell of damp earth and old stone enveloped me. The beam of my flashlight danced across the walls, casting eerie shadows. What I saw next made my blood run cold. In one corner of the basement, hidden behind some old boxes, was a makeshift bed, a pile of blankets and pillows that certainly hadn't been there when I moved in. Beside it was a small collection of food wrappers and water bottles. Someone had been living in my basement. I stood there, frozen in terror, my mind racing with possibilities. How long had they been there? Were they watching me right now? I wanted to scream, but fear had stolen my voice. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs. I whirled around, my flashlight beam catching a glimpse of a shadowy figure retreating up the stairs. I heard the basement door slam shut, followed by the sound of running footsteps above me. Panic took over. I ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst out of the basement and locked the door behind me, then ran through the house, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. But whoever it was had vanished. With shaking hands, I called the police. They arrived quickly, searched the house and the surrounding area, but found no one. They took my statement and advised me to change my locks and install a security system. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house, every shadow in the corner of my eye, sent my heart racing. I had cameras installed, new locks put in, but the fear lingered. It's been months now, and nothing else has happened. But I still can't shake the memory of that night, the realization that someone had been living right beneath my feet. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear noises from the basement. And every time, I wonder, is it just the house settling, or is someone down there waiting to return? Living in this picturesque cottage isn't the dream I thought it would be. The beauty of the countryside now feels like a mask, hiding potential dangers. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, unable to fully relax in my own home. The contrast between the idyllic setting and the terror I experienced is stark and unsettling. I've thought about moving, but something keeps me here. Maybe it's stubbornness, or maybe it's the hope that one day I'll feel safe again in this place I once thought was perfect. But for now, every night as I go to bed, I double-check the locks, turn on all the lights, and try not to think about what or who might be lurking in the shadows of my dream home. The first real snow of the year had just fallen, blanketing Asheville in white. I remember thinking how beautiful it looked as I drove out to my favorite hiking spot in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I'm Kevin, by the way, born and raised here in Asheville, and I've been exploring these woods since I was a kid. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that day in late January. I'd heard about a new trail from some of the regulars at the local gear shop. They said it offered some great views, but warned me to be careful and stick to the marked path. I didn't think much of it at the time. I know these mountains like the back of my hand, right? The hike started off great. The snow crunched under my boots, and my breath puffed out in little clouds. The bare trees were dusted with white, their branches reaching up to a pale blue sky. It was peaceful, you know? Just me in the winter woods. About an hour in, I noticed the temperature starting to drop. I checked my watch to 30 p.m. I figured I had about an hour of good light left, so I decided to push on a little further before turning back. That's when things started to get weird. The air around me seemed to thicken, like it was resisting my movement. The silence became oppressive. No birds, no wind in the trees, not even the sound of snow falling from branches. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I started to feel uneasy, like I was being watched from all sides. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I got this overwhelming urge to run. But run where? I turned around to head back the way I came, but the trail looked different. The trees seemed closer together, their shadows deeper and more menacing. My heart started pounding. I told myself I was just disoriented, that the fading light was playing tricks on me. I pulled out my phone to check my GPS, but of course, there was no signal. Typical. That's when I heard it, a whisper carried on a wind I couldn't feel. It sounded like my name, but distorted, like it was coming from underwater. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and scared. No response, just more whispers, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I started walking faster, trying to retrace my steps. But the faster I walked, the more lost I became. The trees seemed to shift around me, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I swear I saw faces in the knots of the trunks, watching me, their expressions a mix of curiosity and malice. Panic took over. I broke into a run, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. Snow flew up around me, getting in my eyes and mouth. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and warp, minutes feeling like hours. Finally, exhausted and disoriented, I stumbled to a stop. That's when I noticed a clearing ahead, bathed in an eerie, bluish light. In the center stood an ancient, gnarled oak tree, somehow still bearing leaves despite the winter cold. Something about it pulled at me, and before I knew it, I was walking towards it. As I approached the tree, I felt a surge of something. Energy? Magic? I don't know. But when I touched the rough bark, a jolt ran through my body, like static electricity, but 1,000 times stronger. Suddenly, the forest around me shimmered and wavered, like heat rising from pavement. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the sensations. When I opened them again, I was back on the main trail, the normal sounds of the winter forest surrounding me. I checked my watch, 3:30 p.m. Only an hour had passed, but it felt like I'd been lost for days. My clothes were torn and wet, my face scratched, proving it wasn't just some vivid hallucination. I practically ran back to my car, my legs shaky and my mind reeling. Since then, I've tried to research what happened to me. I've found old Cherokee legends about spirit-haunted forests and stories of time slips, but nothing that fully explains what I experienced. I've gone back a few times, trying to find that trail again, but I never can. Thank you for listening. Now try to sleep.